So my topic was on landscape alteration by invasive species. I'm going to start with a short introduction and then I'm going to go a little more in depth after that. So, as you all know, invasives are a very big problem globally. They're a major reason for losses of biodiversity. They cause major economic losses and have major impacts on ecosystem services. So, they're also a major component of human-induced global change. So, we have introduced species to areas that they would have never been able to reach on their own before. So an example of this would be the Burmese python, whose native ranges in Southeast Asia, but is now thriving in the Everglades, along with plenty of other invasives there. So in actuality, very few introduced species are able to colonize a new area, and many go largely unnoticed. But there's a few out there that have pretty enormous impacts. So some of the examples of the worst offenders would be the brown tree snake in Guam, the cane toad in Australia, and Asian carp in the U.S. So, invasive species usually have a negative association with them. So most people think of increased competition, predation, hybridization with natives, and reduced resource availability, but sometimes they can also have some beneficial effects. So the three most common effects of invasives that are considered most commonly in textbooks and literature are altered resource availability, altered food webs, and some altered disturbance trends, which all of those will tie into my next point. But alteration of the physical structure of the environment is very underappreciated, and it's also a very important thing to think about. So in general, invasives can affect ecological, ecosystem, and geomorphological processes. And as Fayonal pointed out, our knowledge is limited on their effect on landform and surface processes. So that made this topic really challenging and made me really realize how limited the amount of studies on this topic that are out there. So here are some examples of some landscapes that have been altered by an invasive. So I'm sure you guys have all been up to the Smokies and have probably been up to Clingman's Dome to see all of the dead trees on the top of there. And that's due to the invasive balsam woolly adelgid in the Smokies. And then in the middle there, that's a kudzu infestation, it's known as the vine that ate the South. And then over on the right is an invasive beaver dam in Chile. So I think it's really a shame that landscape alteration by invasives is underappreciated, because these invasives often have the greatest effect. So they do this through ecosystem engineering, or even a non-engineering invasive can interact with native engineers and really change a landscape. So down at the bottom, that would be rinderpest virus, which is an example of that, and I'll get to that later on in the presentation. So they have such an enormous effect because landscape alteration has cascading effects for native species. So this gets to my key question of how do invasive species alter landscapes? So they either do this directly by changing physical properties of the landscape, so this would be ecosystem engineers, or indirectly by affecting native ecosystem engineers. That's, through predators, competitors, or especially pathogens, as I'll show in a little bit later. So this is all mapped out, or at least my interpretation. I'll get to some of these other points a little later on in the presentation, but it's important to remember throughout all of this that all of these effects can ultimately affect humans through changed ecosystem services. So, I'll start out with invasive ecosystem engineers. So, ecosystem engineering is divided into two categories. So that's allogenic and autogenic. And so allogenic engineers change the landscape by transforming materials from one state to another. So, you think of humans when you hear that. And then autogenic engineers change their environment by their own structures. So, trees, corals, etc. And so these are some of the processes of invasive species that lead to landscape alteration. So it's a really good table that highlights some of the biggest hitters. So one effect of invasive plants in particular is that they colonize areas that previously did not have any vegetation at all. So the poster child of this could be considered cordgrass. So it colonizes lower in the mudflats in the intertidal zone where native species can't grow, which increases sedimentation, which facilitates further invasion. And this is known as positive feedback or an invasional meltdown, which is a topic I'll get a little later on. So you can see where this has happened in San Francisco Bay, where it threatens a lot of restoration projects and some other impacts. I think it's really interesting to see that it's in 2 years its cover spread by 3 times, which is pretty incredible. So other invasive plants simply just convert vegetation cover into more or less heterogeneous compositions. So catclaw mimosas would be an example of an invasive that converts a landscape from multiple cover types into a monoculture, while Spartina, which is the cordgrass that I had just mentioned, actually facilitates more diverse plant growth in cobble beaches in New England. So it stabilizes the cobble substrate and then more vegetation. Both natives and invasives alike are allowed to grow there. And cheatgrass and paperbark trees in the U.S. are also some more examples of this, of both situations. And an interesting example would be the fireweed in Hawaii. So it has the ability to colonize blank lava flows, so kind of like as a pioneer species. And then once it gets in there, it can fix nitrogen in a very nitrogen-limited environment. So as you guys know, nitrogen is often the limiting factor in plant growth. And once it establishes itself in this environment, it can facilitate further plant colonization by natives and invasive species alike. So salt cedars have had some dramatic and probably some unforeseen impacts. So when the salt cedar invaded water-limited environments in the southwest U.S., its high consumption of water can reduce water availability, which also reduces stream and river flow. And this reduced water availability impedes native vegetation growth as well, which obviously is going to have impacts further down in the food chain. So here's a map that actually shows the extent of how far salt cedars have actually colonized. So those are all the states that it's been reported in. Something else that we all need to think about is alteration and disturbance trends, because this can also have major impacts on the landscape. So most commonly people think of fire, and increased fire frequency can help invasives replace natives through positive feedback mechanisms. And this is going on in the Smokies right now. Actually, since the fires, I know that they're really having to fight invasive species that are coming in and recolonizing those areas that have been completely burned down. So, this is known as an invasional meltdown. So, getting to invasive fauna, these are mostly allergenic, but some can be autogenic. So, an example of that would be tube worms. So they build a reefs and structure in environments where there previously wasn't as much. So feral livestock animals are very widespread in many parts of the earth and can have a wide range of impacts through herbivory, selective browsing, and erosion. So this is really highlighting the effects of feral sheep on an island off the coast of California through grazing and erosion. It's an interesting study you guys should read. So islands that ungulates have invaded are especially sensitive as plants and animals there did not co-evolve with herbivory and grazing pressures. So the picture at the bottom really highlights some of the defenses of vegetation against herbivory that island plants simply lack. These can be either physical or chemical or other means. There just wasn't that selective pressure there before. So invasive hogs are one of the big ones. So they pose a great threat to many ecosystems across the world. In the U.S., one study found that they pose the second greatest extinction threat, even next to humans. So back closer to Tennessee, there's a study about how they impacted the Smokies. So they found obviously profound decreases in the understory cover in hog present sites. So that's 2 to 15 to 80 to 110, which is huge. And so invasive herbivores can have really dramatic effects, but what happens when native herbivores are removed from an environment? Well, a rinderpest outbreak decimated ungulate populations in Tanzania in the 1880s. This ended up resulting in the establishment of acacia trees that actually still dominate that landscape today. So the researchers, they knew about the rough time of the impact, and they went back and they aged the stands of acacia trees throughout that landscape, and they found that they, more or less were all of the same age, which they dated back to the 1880s when a lot of the herbivores died off that would have formerly, kept them from growing. So this is an example of indirect alteration by an invasive species. So other pathogens can have landscape-altering effects, such as chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, and whitepox disease in corals. So the really big question to ask is if an invasive is increasing or decreasing habitat complexity. So we've talked about this a little in the class before, that increased habitat complexity tends to increase species richness, and decreased habitat complexity tends to correlate with decreased species richness. So an example of decreased habitat complexity would be kudzu. So you have one cover type, so obviously really low diversity in that particular environment. As you look around there, you pretty much only see one type of vegetation cover. Sometimes invasives can actually increase habitat complexity. So many invasive mussels increase habitat complexity, which has been found to increase the species richness at that particular scale. So they come in, they colonize bare rock or just a really blank bottom, and it adds a large structure in more surface area, which provides habitat for other organisms to live there. So the big take-homes that I want you guys to go away with that invasive species that alter landscape structure often have cascading effects on ecological communities, and these effects can be a lot bigger than invasive species that simply come in and don't have as big an effect on a landscape. So they do so either directly by ecosystem engineering, allogenic or autogenic, or indirectly by affecting native engineers. And then this landscape alteration can facilitate further invasions by invasives through invasional meltdowns. But, despite, the documentation of these effects, it still remains really underappreciated in both invasional and landscape ecology. So it's important to consider if invasive species increases or decreases habitat complexity, because this correlates to increases or decreases in species diversity and richness, and then that will ultimately impact ecosystem services that people depend on. So hope you learned something new and you enjoyed it, and thank you.